Tobias Ellwood, thank you so much for talking Afghanistan with me today. I'm really grateful for you to making time available to come on the show.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you very much indeed.
I just wanted to start with that trip that you made to Afghanistan, which had a huge blowback for you personally and professionally, I say. So just talk about how that trip came about and what you saw and what was it that formed your opinion of the Taliban at that time.
Yeah, my brother was killed by terrorists, by an Al Qaeda affiliate in 2002 in the Bali bombing. And that took me on a journey, I think, into trying to understand what we're doing to counter terrorism. And Britain has I think, a proud history in perhaps stepping forward when other nations don't, to ask the difficult questions, to look for solutions. And certainly that's, I think, why we joined in with the United States and other countries after the 9/11 attack in Afghanistan. So I visited the country about a dozen times from 2005 onwards, and I can see we had this incredible umbrella of security, but it wasn't utilized, it wasn't leveraged, it was squandered in trying to generate a governance structure which was appropriate. We had no idea we imposed Western standards and values. We had a boilerplate solution that we were going to run everything from Kabul, completely ignoring the wonderful mosaic, the wonderful tapestry, if you like, of ethnic groupings, tribal structures that have existed, for hundreds and hundreds of years. We didn't even read our history books. Britain's wandered into that country 3 times, south from the Indus River, as Russia crossed, or from the north, from the Oxus River, part of the Great Game in the 1800s. We lost sight of any of our own history into understanding the people of Afghanistan. And therefore, perhaps it's not surprising that back in 2021, we gave up and handed back the country to the very insurgents we went in to defeat. But that leaves 40 million people who we promised to look after, abandoned, feeling very ostracized, very, very angry. But I don't think any discussion of Afghanistan should really begin today. And certainly this is my lesson from my visit, without paying tribute to the fallen. 455 British service personnel were killed. Hundreds came back with life-changing injuries. 54 of those were from my own regiment. And one of them was a close friend of mine, Colonel Rupert Thornlow, I was at Sandhurst with, blown up. So that is the starting point that we need to reflect on. The question then is, what do we do? And we can ignore, and we can say, right, we're done, we're bruised, we really don't want to talk about it. But what I learned on my visit was that this is the country that has about a couple of years before it implodes, either economically, from a humanitarian perspective, or the advance of ISIS-K. And that is the big drama that we need to watch out for. We may have forgotten about Afghanistan, but Afghanistan hasn't forgotten about us. And if it doesn't implode, there'll be a growth in extremism and radicalization, in attacks across the West, a rekindling of the Al-Qaeda spirit, mass migration. These are all things which will, I think, really test the West, because at a time when global order is really struggling across the world, we are finding it very, very difficult, as we're seeing, the West is being tested, its threshold to be able to keep our international rules-based order operating. And I'm simply saying, let's learn a little bit about what's going on in Afghanistan. Let's open the embassy, as Japan, as the EU, as other countries have done, and just understand that there are some nuances in Afghanistan which makes the views of the Taliban in Kandahar, those extreme diktats about women's rights and so forth, the interpretation is very different in Kabul. The Kabul Taliban recognize you need female doctors. You can't have male doctors working with females. You need females working in the workforce. So they're quietly given licenses out to work. They are quietly allowed to have education through Zoom lessons, as we had during COVID. there is a real nuance to what's going on in Afghanistan. And the biggest question for the West is the trajectory of events is not good. Us shouting from afar, is it having any effect? Or is there a better way of understanding what's going on, bearing in mind, as we were actually discussing earlier, that this is actually just another phase in the history of Afghanistan. But the people of Afghanistan, I didn't meet anybody over there, and indeed since then, and I met many of the diasporas who are calling for regime change. And if you're not calling for regime change, and we're not talking about recognizing the Taliban, absolutely not. What we're talking about is whether there's engagement to be done to influence better where this country can go over the years. It was, I think, McCain, the Senator McCain, who was asked after he'd been, finally, he left Vietnam, having lived in a hole, I think, for, being kept as a prisoner. He was asked, when should we engage with Vietnam? And he said immediately. And that is the mindset, it's a strategic mindset about what we should do. And these are the tough questions that I simply ask.
But Mr. Ellwood, there is engagement, nuanced engagement with understanding of who the Taliban are. That has been happening from day one. As you said, Europeans, non-Europeans have had their kind of full-on or semi-full-on engagement with the Taliban. Their full-on assault on women and ethnic groups and Pashtuns who are opposing the group have continued non-stop. I mean, this week alone, the Taliban have been rounding up women in the streets of Kabul. And you look at the group's 2-year in charge of the country, the forced displacements, extrajudicial killings, you name it. There has been no crime that the Taliban has not yet committed. Gender apartheid, any engagement, any sort of, easing off relationship with the Taliban by them is seen as an approval of what they do, as a normalization of what they do.
I absolutely disagree. And that's
that's the attitude. That's what they said in response to what you.
I'm telling you, it's a simplistic attitude to have that idea that somehow we can shout from afar because of what's going on. Do you think they listen? Do you think the Taliban listen? It actually helps the hardliners in Kandahar when we actually keep our distance, when we're not understanding what's going on and appreciating that there actually are changes taking place in different areas. Absolutely right to condemn those things, but condemn them from Kabul. Condemn them from a meeting with the Taliban.
But what difference will that make? The Taliban do not really bother.
Let me finish, okay? Because people shouting from London has no impact whatsoever, as I understood. But when you go there and appreciate where this country could go to, that there is a tension between the practitioners, as The Economist calls them, in Kabul, where the country is going to go to over the next few years, and what the Kandahar, what the Akhundzada, the supreme leader, is wanting to say, completely isolated. It doesn't even have a television, let alone be on the internet. This is the dilemma that Afghanistan faces. But what do the people of Afghanistan want? What do the 40 million people of Afghanistan want? Do they want us to remain shouting from afar, or to engage and understand what's going on and condemn from inside Kabul, inside meeting rooms, as I did at every meeting I had with every member of the Taliban? I asked and condemned what they were doing to women, to girls, and so forth. And the UN head of the UN there as well, made it very clear that that's exactly what she does. But you learn then further the fact that actually there's more dangers, which we don't see. And I'm sorry, I disagree with you. The FCDO does not understand the detail here because they are not there. Half of all 11-year-olds in the country, half of them, boys and girls, are getting no education, zero education. Why? Because the schools don't exist. Now, when half a generation grows up without any education, they are ripe to be radicalized, to be the next generation of extremists. And ISIS-K is growing in capability in Afghanistan. So fine, we can agree that you say, don't bother with it. And I'm saying that attitude, that strategy will lead to something far greater and more dramatic, which will affect us because of the scale of migration, the scale of terror threats, and indeed further consequences in the region if we don't engage. And it goes against, I'm afraid, British and our internationalist approach to understand what's going on and provide convening power to leverage greater effect. The fact that we've stopped doing that probably since the Cold War, where we give up, we have no strategic patience, whether it be Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Yemen, Libya, Somalia, all these countries we dabble in, get bored, and then wander out, and then wonder why the governance and security then collapses.
Well, the Taliban wouldn't care either if you're in an embassy in Kabul. If the British had an ambassador in Kabul, if the US had an ambassador in Kabul, I mean, the US envoys, the British ambassadors, the Europeans, they meet them in Doha, they meet them in Kabul, but it's had no effect, no impact on the Taliban's behavior. It's hardened their attitude towards the West. It's made them proud of their, more stricter in their outlook, because they know where they are, they know the short-sightedness of the West, and they know where they're holding the people of Afghanistan in. Now, you said you met the Taliban figures in Kabul and criticized them on their face, but that hasn't translated in anything. And as you say, other ambassadors have been doing in Kabul. That has not translated in anything. But what I say is what the people of Afghanistan, I suppose, demand is accountability. We are in the age of, as the former British Foreign Secretary termed it, the age of impunity. Now, there has to be what the people of Afghanistan really are concerned, the people I speak to in the villages that I come from, the people in Kabul and elsewhere, who people are suffering enormously. When you talk about hunger, when you talk about deprivation, I watched my own little brother die in front of me of hunger. We were living under Taliban blockade. I watched him die in front of me. I know how he feels and the pain that it brings. The Taliban are the cause of all that. They're not the suffering that the people of Afghanistan are suffering from are inflicted on them by the Taliban. And do you think for all that they've been doing, the gender apartheid, the persecution of the Hazaras, the Tajiks and the Uzbeks in Panjshir, in northern Afghanistan, in southern Afghanistan, do you think recognition, if more engagement, will be a reward for their actions?
You're twisting my words, sir. You really, really are. Okay, shame on you, really. I'm saying engage, and then you moved on to recognition. That is a different scale of concern here. I absolutely agree with you of what the Taliban is doing, and that should be condemned, absolutely. But I'm sorry, I disagree that you represent all the voices of Afghanistan.
I didn't claim that I represent all the voices of
Afghanistan. You're making a case and an argument not to engage. And I'm saying that is simplistic. It really, really is. It's not how we work in the international community. When we don't like something, we just back away and expect it to change because we shout from afar. It doesn't work that way. It really, really doesn't. And I'm sorry, but
I appreciate the need.
People, if you're not actually on the ground and understand it, you get a very different perspective as to what's absolutely happening. You don't see the detail of what could be done, of the direction of travel, of how projects could advance forward, of actually making sure, indeed, that humanitarian aid can support the very people, such as in that village, because 1/5 of the aid is getting into the country that the head of the UN, who I met, is required. Therefore, there is absolutely a humanitarian disaster about to take place. And our embassy right now is shut. And I'm not saying that there's some utopian answer that we open our embassy and suddenly things are going to change. Not at all. But can we not leverage more change, more influence by being on the ground rather than actually reducing our aid budget to the country? That's not, I say, it's not the British way of doing things. It's not the United Nations way of doing things. And some of the voices that are calling for us to engage are very powerful indeed. Former Afghan MPs, academics, people who worked in there. There are many Afghans. As I say, I think you'd be the only one, if you were arguing this, when you've yet to say, let's not engage. Because I haven't met anybody, I'll be honest. And as you began at the beginning, there's a lot of noise made by my trip, and a lot of people chose rather, to attack me rather than look at the issue that I was trying to highlight, is what's going on in Afghanistan. What can we actually do about it? And as I say, there is no call for regime change, but every call to engage. And I'm keen to hear whether you think that we should not engage. Because
and what limit should
I ask you the question.
What limit should the engagement? I mean, is it a limitless engagement? What limit should there be for that engagement? What principle that engagement should be based on?
Well, by engagement, you're then, all I'm asking for is for us to better understand the country, because we do not. We do not understand the nuances. When I came back, when I went to Afghanistan and appreciated the tensions there are between the hardliners in Kandahar and what the practitioners are doing in Kabul, the practitioners, the Taliban, who send their children to school in Dubai. This is the difficulties that we then see. This is the people in Kabul are then giving a green light to education lessons for everybody on the internet and on television as well, on national television, knowing that they can't afford to see radicalization take place because people are not educated, knowing that they need female doctors. When I went through the airport at Kabul, who stamped my passport? It was a woman that stamped my passport, and she's allowed to continue to do that. So yes, there are some intolerable things that the Taliban has done. Those diktats that come out almost monthly now with more extremes. But are they being imposed everywhere? Very much not the case. It depends very much on the governor of the area that you're dealing with as to whether they take them as read, or indeed just nuance them, because they know in practice this does not work. So Afghanistan continues to be in a period of transition. And the question is whether we watch this play out, and as I said, into a very dangerous place, or we show interest, because I believe we have a duty to those 40 million people we abandoned.
But does that include, Britain opening up its embassy in Kabul? Does that mean allowing Taliban diplomats to take over the Afghan embassy in London?
Well, that's a question for the Foreign Office themselves to discuss and debate. That's the detail that needs to be put forward. But I'm saying the current strategy of cutting our budget for Afghanistan and not engaging through the embassy, which is, as I say, what everybody is calling for, including the United Nations. And it came up at the General Assembly again and again and again, that we have no influence if we don't engage.
But there's also this question of there has to be a consequence for what the Taliban are doing, consequences for their actions, the gender apartheid, and what mechanism should there be in place for holding the Taliban accountable for? I mean, some people, Gordon Brown, for example, has argued that the ICC should intervene because of the Taliban's persecution of women and others amount to crimes against humanity, and others have said the same thing. Now, how do you balance engagement with a group like that, where they're against all the norms that Britain and hundreds of thousands of people in Afghanistan died to cherish and to protect and defend? And of course, there are people still in the country who are fighting. And as in August 2021, you were talking about people opposing the Taliban, fighting the Taliban, and you yourself were talking about this is not being the end of the story for Afghanistan. And as we just mentioned, this is just a phase in Afghanistan's conflict. Is it for you then the question about managing the fallout or normalizing the Taliban?
Again, these are all questions to be explored. But as I say, there is an understanding from all the leaders that we met in Kabul that they are desperate for international support. And there's $9 billion that's frozen there. That could alleviate a lot of the humanitarian challenges that the country faces, easily conditional on improving the support for women and girls. But that's to be explored through greater coordination and engagement. That's what needs to be done. But right now, we have no interest. There's no appetite. There's not even a strategy to have those conversations. I'm sorry, but this idea that an ambassador can fly in and then fly out in a day and somehow have the same level of influence as an embassy that's open all the time. I'm sorry, that's not how diplomacy works.
And I'm sure you've been studying Afghanistan closely for a long time, and as you have, the Taliban's opponents, the former leaders of non-Pashtun groups, and of course some Pashtun leaders and commanders have been talking about reorganizing. And of course, the son of Ahmad Shah Massoud, he's leading a resistance group. There's another resistance group fighting the Taliban. So they've been mounting pockets of guerrilla fights against the Taliban in different parts of the country. And I suppose, given the dire situation on the ground, and according to the UN, 28 million people in Afghanistan are dependent on humanitarian aid to survive. Now, you've got that big number of people starving. That is a recipe anyone can argue, or no one can deny that that's a recipe for bloodshed, destruction, all sorts of ills that will spill over across the country. And given that the region has changed with the Middle East, the war in Ukraine, has your views modified in a sense since you just made that trip to Afghanistan? Or you still believe in that very principle of engagement as you defined?
My views were shaped by the people I met, by the head of the United Nations in Kabul, by the various diasporas that I've met before and then after that, by the other voices, Rory Stewart, General David Petraeus, General David Richards, who served in Afghanistan, who understand the country, and diplomats up and down, from DC to in London and across Europe as well. I haven't met anybody. I haven't met anybody that says don't engage. The people who have been critical of me, quite understandably, is because of my miscommunication in trying to get my message across. And I make that very, very clear that I immediately corrected myself and clarified what's going on. But it's you understand this, I think, from your own experience. It's a very nuanced situation there. It cannot be covered in a banner headline and in simplistic terms. And the dangers there, the impact for British security interests are immense, not least for European as well. And if we are a P5 member of the United Nations, we should take an interest in this part of the world, not least because of our recent history, but also our wider history as well. And
when it was that video, it was that communication, it was the words that were used, and of course, people, you opened a floodgate on yourself, and the terms that were used against you: appeaser, apologist, useful idiot, all sorts of things. And how did that make you feel? I know people, I spoke to them, and I was one of your critics, and I still believe we disagree on many things, but people were really fearful, given that your position as one of the most senior politicians in the British Parliament, the head of the chair of the Defence Select Committee, it was not just what you said, it was the position that you held at that time, and also the position you still hold, that made really people fear that this may be the Britain's default position going to normalization of the Taliban. That was really what made people angry and fearful and offended in many ways.
Well, if you said you criticized me, why didn't you get in touch and ask me what I meant? Why is it that you then took that? I wrote a lot. I spoke a lot. All sorts of things I did. But one clip was then taken out of context. I'm sorry, given your interest as a journalist as well, you didn't reach out and say, so what did you mean by that? I think I could have clarified easily. But
you're overloaded with requests. I did try. You're overloaded.
Well, maybe you did. Maybe you did. Yeah, and I did clarify. But perhaps it's also an indictment of where politics is today, that there is a gotcha culture, if you like. There is little appetite to allow for error to be made and so forth. Political curiosity is important in politics. If somebody is willing to look 3 or 4 chess moves ahead and flag up concerns, that should be welcomed. And the art of disagreeing, we shouldn't lose sight of. You may disagree with me, you may not understand what I've said, but pursue more, ask more questions. And those that did and got in touch, understood where I'm coming from, and then actually agreed with me. And that's, I think, an important lesson is into all of this. Those issues that I highlighted back in July continue to this day. They haven't gone away.
And how do you foresee the future for Afghanistan as you see it, given as you know the West's apathy, the regional actors' deeper engagement? I mean, what you've been saying, and you mentioned Rory Stewart and others. It is not that what you say is odd or different to what others said, and it is the expectation of certain values from the West that really made people offended. The values that mattered, and that
I'm sorry. Can I just correct? Can I just make a case here? We're now months away.
Yeah,
I spent a lot of time talking about the summer.
Yeah.
Sir, move on. Move on. This isn't about me. This is about Afghanistan. Okay, and you still haven't yourself answered the question as to whether you believe, as somebody that knows the country actually arguably, well, definitely better than me, whether you agree that we should engage with the Taliban. Your voice is arguably more important than mine.
We already engaged with the Taliban in many different fronts.
No, we don't. We're not.
Diplomatic.
We're not. I'm sorry, but the UK is not engaging with the Taliban. No minister has met, been out there. I think I'm the only MP that's bothered to visit. It's not on the radar. We've cut our DFID budget. So please don't tell me that in any form that the UK has got some active engagement in understanding and influencing the direction of travel of where Afghanistan is now going after we spent 20 years there, lost almost 500 people, and with thousands coming back with injuries, and spent over £20 billion. We are not. It's in the rearview mirror, and we're now focusing on Ukraine, on Gaza and the Middle East, and other aspects too. So there's no engagement of any scale whatsoever that could change the direction of travel of where the country is now going. And that will affect Britain and America and other countries in the longer term. And it will further anger an already disappointed population of Afghanistan that is so upset that the West has turned its back on the country after being there for so long.
But do you see, I spoke to Sir Nick Hay, Sir Laura Bristow, and others. There's a prevalent belief, and of course, as we just mentioned, Afghanistan is just going through this phase. Given the Taliban's attitude, its behavior, its policies, do you see that rule, the manner which it rules, sustainable? And can that be changed through engagement?
No, it's absolutely deplorable what elements or firstly the wider diktats that come out from Kandahar and the implementation of those diktats on the ground. And you covered one of them, of how women are treated in public. When they go out to demonstrate, they are rounded up. That is absolutely to be condemned. You're absolutely right. My question is as to whether we had greater impact in condemning that on the ground rather than from afar. And then, like I said, there is a recognizing that there is this absolute tension between where Kabul want to take the country and where Kandahar do. And it's very, very clear that, and my view is that with effort, we can actually see Kabul gain traction over the hardliners in Kandahar.
Now, Afghanistan's the current situation cannot change, and I believe, without an inclusive political settlement. And the Taliban have shown no inclination that they'll be prepared to accommodate other ethnic groups, leaders who've got a stake in this. What is your ideas of how that can come about? Without a political settlement, the possibility of civil war, of course, is you cannot discount. So how can that come about?
Well, you look at the journey that any authoritarian state has made. I mean, go back to Vietnam as well. You go back to any of these countries that have gone from a one-party system where there's been supreme rule to the growth and advance of governance structures, usually from the grassroots perspective, from a local perspective, which is actually how Afghanistan is often run. You know, the local lawyer Jurgis, for example, inclusivity done because good people step forward wanting to lead local communities. It is going to take time. There's no doubt about it. But that journey can be helped by international assistance, and it can be advanced and expedited by engagement. If we leave it on its own devices, like I said, it's not that the Taliban are going to then become further hardline and that's the way it is. That's the status quo. It's because the country will then collapse. That a new terrorist capability in the form of ISIS-K will be as large and as dangerous as Al-Qaeda. And then that will lead to greater mass migration in a country. And eventually China on its doorstep will want to control this. And don't forget what China does to its weaker population, literally next door. Yeah. We have an embassy in China still, don't we?
And so what should, you know, leaving Taliban aside, what should the West's attitude and relationship be with anti-Taliban figures and groups?
Well, it's not for me. I'm not the foreign secretary, nor am I the head of the United Nations. But critically, they have a role to advance where this goes, and they are part of the tapestry of Afghanistan, and how the governance structures, you know, advance and develop requires their inclusion. There's no doubt about it. But as you touched on, you know, civil war, or, you know, wanting to overthrow the Taliban, or you implied that, I think, in what you said. I don't see that. As I said, I've spoken to a lot of people, regular communicators with a lot of people, and I pose this question. The first question I ask anybody is, do you want regime change? Are you calling for regime change? Nobody says that. Nobody wants to, partly because they're war weary. They're exhausted. The last time there's been any relative peace was, go back to President Dowd's time, I think in the 70s.
No, it's fascinating. I'm really grateful that we've had some fireworks, but you know, it's all in good terms. I'm grateful for your time, but let's bring the temperature down a bit. Let's talk about your trip and what you saw in Kabul, and you went to Kandahar and Helmand. Talk about the anecdotes of that trip. You know, the non-political, non-diplomatic, non-Taliban stuff.
Yeah, I mean, it really was, as I say, quite a shock in one sense, to having traveled so many times, usually in a helicopter with all the combat, you know, protection, flak jackets and helmets and so on, to see this eerie calm. You know, security is different, but that's because the Taliban's daily attacks have stopped. You know, satellite images confirm the opium trade is significantly down, but that's because the Taliban's black market to fund its insurgency is gone, and farmers can grow other crops and take them to market without fear of running into the Taliban's IEDs. So, you know, it's the Taliban that has been at the cause of all this. Let's not kid ourselves in any sense. But and then for that perspective, speaking to people, there is an appreciation that, oh my goodness, it is calm. I can travel. You know, we traveled everywhere, and there were no checkpoints. There was no guards anywhere like that. There was the ability to move around the country as you wished, but there was also clearly humanitarian challenges absolutely everywhere. And as I say, just 1/5 of the aid is getting in. I think 28 million people are reliant on humanitarian support. That's huge. You know, it's over half the population. Over 90% are under the poverty line. You know, it's a very serious situation here, and not enough aid is getting in, and you can see how fragile this country is. You know, from an economic perspective, 3/4 of Ashraf Ghani's budget came from the US. That's now gone, and you know, it's just astonishing where things are, and a worry that, you know, China, Russia, and Iran are working overtime to leverage their interest in what's happening there.
And what would be your message to the people of Afghanistan who'd be listening to this podcast in Kabul, in Bamiyan, in Mazar-e-Sharif, who don't really see a lot of light at the end of the tunnel?
No, and it is in this darkest moments that you have to ask yourself and dig deep and work out where to go next. But the current strategy of doing little is having no influence whatsoever. In fact, it's the opposite of that, because it actually helps the hardliners. It helps the hardliners, and that for me is the dangerous point here.
And of course, the West's 20-year engagement in Afghanistan created this generation of educated, worldly generation of men and women who cannot unlearn, who will not unlearn what they learned. And that experience will not be erased by whatever the Taliban do. And also the diaspora, who's ballooned into a very large number in Europe and America and elsewhere. So what do you see their role? And also what should, in your ideal position, what should the West do to continue to bolster civil society? And of course, with the role that the diaspora can play.
Yeah, I think that is the core issue here. If you have all the urban areas have access to the internet, and free internet, they can look at whatever they like, which is interesting. But that's allowed to happen, and again, that's because of the Kabul Taliban, and that's where
China's getting onto that. China's getting onto that. The gears that they're going to provide them to curtail the access to the internet. So you're quite right on the Chinese role in Afghanistan.
Yeah. This is the nuanced opportunity that needs to be leveraged, and so we don't lose the benefits that were accumulated over 20 years, the freedoms and so forth. And it's there's no doubt about it. It's hard work at the moment, but the moment that tussle between Kandahar and Kabul, Kandahar's winning. Kandahar's winning. We need to engage more and empower those who took over the ministries. The ministries are pretty much as they were. Only you've now got a senior Taliban in charge of the ministry. All the civil servants remain very much in place. The numbers of various departments we went to, it was very, very clear who was the Taliban and who were the original civil servants, just by their clothing. It's a very sad situation. It's demoralizing, to see this country where it is after 20 years. And I'm in a way grateful that I've shone a light on it, even though it's come at a cost. This isn't anything to do with me. It's to do with the country itself, and it's the opportunity. You think back at the incredible work that took place in the 1940s to the 1970s in an area that you'll be familiar with called Little America. It's all the offshoots around the Helmand River, where the American company that built the Hoover Dam went down there and created the tributaries, the irrigation systems. And it now means that Helmand is the breadbasket, continues to be the breadbasket, not just for Afghanistan, but wider as well. And you go down there, you see the US aid stamped in on the old pumps and bits and pieces, which are still there today. That was really, hearts and minds building. That's what we should have been doing in the 20 years that we were there. And none of that took place. The Falang Tunnel could have been improved. You could have built a railway line from Spin Baldak to Kandahar. That would have, it's only about 40 miles. That would have been game-changing to link Kandahar to the international railway network. Likewise, it's happened in Mazar-e-Sharif, actually linking it north into this old Soviet system. These are the things that allow trade to develop. And when trade develops, prosperity advances and people's income starts to go, the communities start to benefit from it. These are the things that we've lost sight of what do you do? I'm afraid, defeating the enemy is not enough. You need to enable the locals so they can take on the responsibility. And we didn't do any of that over 20 years, not to any scale at all.
And do you foresee the trajectory that we're on, any future Western security engagement in Afghanistan if nothing changes?
Oh, there's no appetite to go back whatsoever. I mean, there's no appetite even to put the fire out in the Middle East, is there? Or indeed Ukraine. You know, we slide weapons across the table, but say we don't want to have, you know, we're not going to put boots on the ground. And our adversaries know that and recognize that. They see how risk averse we've become. So.
And so what did all that storm that was created by what you said did to you personally? How did it feel those days?
Yeah, it was unpleasant. It's bruising, and it's not what politics should be about. We've become rather intolerant in how things are debated. You know, it's political curiosity is critical in any parliament. You should be able to allowed to probe, to ask questions, to say on difficult things. But it's so easy now to dismiss and lambast and criticize and go for the person, not the ball. You know, in today's day and age, not least with social media as well. Yeah, it's not pleasant, and I think it discourages other parliamentarians from daring to speak their mind, and that can't be a good thing.
Amid all the grim realities around us, Europe, Middle East, Afghanistan, Sudan, but specifically on Afghanistan, when you left the country and flew off the Kabul airport, what made you hopeful, if there were any, about the country and the future of the country? I mean, since your engagements ever since, I mean, what makes you hopeful about Afghanistan, if there's anything that is?
If I left Afghanistan thinking that the entire authoritarian structure, the most ruthless interpretation of Sharia law in the world, was absolutist, as we see in Kandahar, yeah, I'd be deeply, deeply depressed. But I saw something different in Kabul as the potentially something that would take a decade to change, there's no doubt about it, that could lead to greater inclusion, greater openness. Still going to be an authoritarian state, but democracy has gone decline across the world. But countries are not bothering with it anymore. We perhaps don't, with Donald Trump about to be elected, perhaps we don't give the best exemplars of, how democracy should be used. But that doesn't prevent any country from advancing and making sure that there are some basic freedoms of human rights, particularly to do with women and girls and education. It's not in Afghanistan's interest, the Taliban's interest, to deny all school children or half of school children under the age of 11, let alone girls, no education whatsoever. That doesn't lead to an advancing economy. That leads to radicalization, which the Taliban know they will not be able to control.
And on that note, I'm so grateful for your time. Thank you so much. And it's been a pleasure talking to you, although we had some fireworks, but it's great. It's great. Thank you.
All right. Yeah. Thanks very much indeed.
Thank you.